co-organizers of this. Surya has many projections on many different vectors. He has listed some of those here, but I always find listening to him very delightful.
Thank you, Jitendra. Can you hear me okay? All right. So I'll also start with a history, and I know Jitendra went back to the 1950s. I wanted to one-up him and go back to the ancient Greeks. So one thing to keep in mind, and especially for this day and age, is that our theories of brains and minds have always been dominated by or perhaps limited by the technology of the day, right? So ancient Greeks' theory of how the brain worked was dominated by their water and hydraulic technology. Hippocrates thought of the body as having 4 fundamental humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And without balance of these humors, you'd get disease, and the nerves conveyed an animal spirit or fluid again between the brain and the body to balance the humors. Okay? If you go up to the 1600s, we didn't really have great technology to mimic the brain. And so in the absence of that technology, Descartes actually proposed Cartesian dualism, where the mind is a non-physical substance separate from the body. Okay? If you go a little bit further, Hobbes was motivated by now thinking of the mind as a machine as well, with like intricate clockwork and so forth as an inspiration. And he even talked about the reciprocal action of springs as underlying the substance of humans. Right? He was this close to inventing these Kuramoto oscillators that actually play a role in modeling the brain in certain parts of the brain. Okay, so a big advance was, Galvani, Volta, Helmholtz, and so forth discovered that electricity plays a role. They could make frogs' legs twitch, dead frogs' legs twitch, by injecting electricity into them. And then, it was only like at the end of the 1800s, in these debates by Golgi versus Cajal, where Golgi thought of the brain as a continuum model, and Cajal thought of the brain as a discrete network, the so-called neuron doctrine, a network of neurons. And ironically, Golgi's new stain proved Cajal right. Okay, so we came upon the idea of neural networks only at the turn from the 1800s to 1900s. In the late 1900s, the telegraph was one of the dominant technologies of the day. And so we had the sort of the telegraph model of the brain, and they Hodgkin and Huxley borrowed these cable equations for spatial temporal signal propagation of electrons across wires. And they actually discovered the accurate equations for nervous signal propagation. I actually teach these equations to this day in my theoretical neuroscience class. And this garnered a Nobel Prize, and this really explained how neurons fire. Of course, Turing came along, from Babbage to Turing, and then computing took off as a metaphor for what the brain does. To some extent, that's correct, and in many ways, it's not correct. Everything's a partial picture, right? Always keep that in mind. And then we had the famous results of the mid-1900s, where McCulloch and Pitts invented the perceptron, motivated by neurons. Minsky and Papert threw cold water on that and said perceptrons can only solve linear separable problems. It killed the field for a while. Sybenko noted that but one hidden layer allows you to solve anything. That's the universal approximation theorem. But of course, it doesn't tell you how big of a network you need, so it's not that useful. And then, statistical physics played a huge role. Hopfield came along, and he connected things at 2 very disparate levels. Hebbian learning at the level of synapses, neurons that fire together, wire together, and the very notion of memory itself at the level of psychology. Like if I meet somebody at a conference for the first time, I see their face, I remember their name. The next time I see them, I see their face. Sorry, I learn their name. The next time I see them, I see their face, I recall their name. So he connected these 2 very disparate scales of organization, biophysics to psychology, in a very beautiful and simple model of memory inspired by the statistical physics of spin glasses and so forth. And this led in kind of a direct pathway from Hopfield to Boltzmann machines, to restricted Boltzmann machines, to stacked restricted Boltzmann machines, which gave rise to the first deep network, which eventually made Jeff Hinton a physicist. And so we are all physicists now. It's official word from the Nobel Prize Committee. I actually met Jeff Hinton recently at a conference, and he was quite embarrassed, actually, but he has good humor. And honestly, I think this is an inspired. My personal opinion is this is an inspired choice of a Nobel Prize, because the work of Hopfield inspired an entire generation of physicists to come into neuroscience and machine learning and so forth. And these ideas really did play a role in creating the first deep network. And of course, the technology took off in a way that we don't really use these deep belief networks anymore. But this was the first situation where you could really stack these things deeply and train them. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. So now the impact of the deep learning revolution on neuroscience itself, for the first time we can go beyond humors, dualism, clocks, and all this other stuff, beyond toy neural networks, and actually get performant neural networks that mimic complex human and animal cognition in the domains of sensation, action, decision-making, memory, and yes, language. And they can predict with extremely high accuracy the activity of individual neurons of animals and humans engaging in these behaviors. We have never had that before in the last 2,000 years. And I think that's remarkable and exciting. Caveats are going to follow. Okay? So how do we get these performant networks? Well, in neuroscience, there's kind of two major approaches. One is you directly fit neural networks to neural activity during behavior, and you try to model both the behavior and the neural activity. A critical issue is, of course, you might get overfitting if you don't have enough data. The other is just task training. Train a neural network to solve a task that an animal or human is doing, and then hope that the internal representations of that neural network mimic the internal representations of the animal or the human in terms of neural activity patterns. A critical issue, of course, is how to compare a trained neural network to the brain, and so forth. So people have achieved a lot of success with each of these methods, and I'll give you some examples. But a major issue that arises in both cases is explainability. Are we simply replacing something we don't understand, i.e. the brain, with a quote-unquote digital twin or model of some part of the brain? We don't want to just stop at a model. We want to obtain conceptual understanding, explainability, testable predictions, and so forth. So I'm actually quite bullish on the role of explainable AI to extract these things, so go from the model to conceptual understanding and testable predictions that then drive the design of next generation experiments in neuroscience. Right? But we don't have to stop there. Technology in neuroscience now allows us to write neural activity patterns into the brain at relatively large scales. For example, my collaborator Carl Dijkstra at Stanford can control the activity of up to 1,000 neurons and write in any pattern stimulation onto 1,000 neurons that he wants to. So we can now do write experiments to the brain. So you can imagine situations where you record from the brain, build a model of it, apply control theory to control the model in ways that you desire, either for conceptual understanding, for testing a theory, for achieving a desired clinical state. And then you apply the designed stimulation patterns to the model back to the brain to test your understanding or to achieve the desired clinical state. Right? So we can learn the language of the brain and write that language back to it. So that's incredibly exciting. And by the way, we can, of course, already do that in our neural models, our AI models as well. Okay, so I will give you some examples. Most of my examples will be outside of language, but some will connect to language. And the reason is that I think deep learning in visual neuroscience has made more progress so far than deep learning in language neuroscience, only because language neuroscience is a newer subject, and LLMs have not been around as long. So for example, task-trained networks in other domains have been around for many years. LLMs have only been around for a couple of years. Explainable AI of language models is a relative new subject. Explainable AI of vision models is a little bit more developed, though of course lots of work to do there. For writing experiments, invasive single neuron recordings or reading experiments, invasive single neuron resolution recordings of the human brain during language are harder to do, but a lot can still be done with low resolution fMRI, ECOG, MEG, PET, OPM, and so forth. And you'll hear about some of this stuff from the speakers later in the week. But write experiments into the brain relevant for human language at single resolution are quite difficult to do at this moment. So one thing I'd like to dream about is ways that we can dream of transferring the success of vision neuroscience to language neuroscience. So this is what I'll actually talk about. So I'll give you one example of directly fitting vision neural networks and using explainable AI to extract a conceptual understanding. Okay, then we'll shift to task-trained networks, going from vision to language, and I'll give you examples of successful task-trained networks. Then I'll do a case study of theory, which is a theory of one-shot learning, right? That's a remarkable capability. We can learn in one or few shots. It's kind of like the analog of in-context learning in LLMs. And can we do, say, zero-shot transfer from language to vision? So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about read-write experiments on brains and machines, where basically explainability of LLMs looks like neuroscience on LLMs. So I'll give you two examples of work that we've done on read-write experiments on brains and machines. One where we can make mice hallucinate images that we decide by writing directly into the mouse's brain. And another where we make LLM graders that grade essays. We can make them hallucinate that an essay is really good by modifying its internal neural activity patterns through a sufficiently crafted adversarial prompt. Then I'll talk about, since this is an LLM thing, I couldn't resist talking about our most recent work in LLMs. This is on mathematical reasoning in LLMs. In particular, how do we co-design or fine-tune, how do we co-design the fine-tuning stage of training an LLM with the scaling up of test time compute for an LLM. It turns out you really have to co-design those things, and if you don't, you'll be suboptimal. And then the last thing I'll talk about, diffusion models for vision, actually, and an analytic theory of creativity in vision, in diffusion models for vision. And interestingly, diffusion models have also been used in language, so it'd be interesting to think about how the theory of creativity of diffusion models in vision might be co-opted to understand the theory of creativity of diffusion models or LLM-based transformers in language. So that's kind of the menu. All right, so let's get started. So the first one, this one, directly fitting vision networks. This is a series of papers. The final paper kind of supersedes the rest, this last paper, and I'll just give it to you at a very high level, right? So this is trying to understand the first steps of visual processing in the retina, right? So we already know a lot about the retina. So this is a good case study for can deep learning help us advance science in the retina, using the retina as a case study. So this is your retina. You have photoreceptors that absorb single photons. They go through a layer of bipolar cells and then go to ganglion cells. You have 100 million optic nerve fibers emanating from the ganglion cells, and everything you know about the visual world comes from those optic nerve fibers. So it's a relatively complicated circuit with a few hidden layers. The classic models of this correspond to a spatiotemporal filter followed by a rectifying nonlinearity. This is a pretty good model for the retinal response to low-resolution white noise, but it's not a good model for the retinal response to high-resolution natural movies. They're very stimuli that sculpted the evolution of the retina itself. Okay. So we tried to fit a more complicated model, a multi-layer convolutional neural network. We did an architecture search, and we found that sort of two hidden convolutional layers is the best solution. And we trained the model to mimic the actual retina's response to natural movies. Okay, and there's tons of reasons this could have been a terrible idea. One, we might not have had enough data to train the model. Turned out we didn't need to worry about that. As long as you can record, say, only 20 neurons simultaneously for 1 hour, that's enough to fit a model that has really good predictive performance on held-out data. In fact, it can predict responses to new natural movies almost as well as you can possibly expect, given an intrinsic ceiling on predictability, given by the intrinsic stochasticity of the retina itself. Okay, so we didn't have to worry about number one. Number two, and these were all the things that I worried about, but luckily my students didn't listen to me. Even if we obtain a generalizing model, the internal steps that you take to go from stimuli to response in the model may have nothing to do with the internal steps taken to go from stimulus to response in the actual retina, right? Luckily, we didn't have to worry about that. Fitting the retinal response to natural movies was enough to constrain the interior functional properties of these neurons, such that if we recorded from a hidden neuron in our model, we could identify it with a hidden neuron in the retina. So for example, hidden neurons here mapped to hidden neurons here in the retina. I'm not showing you all that data because it's a short talk, but okay, but now, worry number three, even if we match the internal computational steps, we may not understand how the model works. What does understanding mean anyways? We may not be able to derive testable hypotheses. Well, what are interesting hypotheses to test? And three, we may not develop scientific principles governing retinal operation. And of course, an open question is, what is a principle? These are general open questions that the field of deep learning and neuroscience together will have to come to terms with. I'll give you our best answers to these questions in this case study in the retina. Okay, so how do we go about answering these questions? Well, before we had good models of the retinal response to natural movies, retinal physiologists did all sorts of crazy experiments of the retina by showing moving bars, full field flashes, gratings, and so forth. And they built up 2 decades worth of experiments that elicited all sorts of interesting nonlinear response properties of the retina, right? So we asked, well, what if we repeated these 2 decades of experiments? Would our model get them all correct? And remarkably, it got them all correct with no further training. So just to show you how surprising these things are, let me show you a couple of them. The emitted stimulus response. So this is a situation where you show full field flashes, and the retina will entrain to those flashes, these periodic flashes, but then you emit a flash. The retina will will create a huge complaint and send it to the brain right at the time when the emitted flash was supposed to come in, and it does this for a range of frequencies. So it's as if the retina learns that the world has a periodic structure, and violations of that periodicity generate a huge complaint sent to the brain, right? Motion reversal. You all know about Newton's first law. Objects that are in motion tend to remain in motion. But if an object suddenly reverses, it violates Newton's first law, and where it reverses, the retina generates a huge complaint and sends it to the brain, right? Also, segregating local from global motion is another interesting thing. So the retina is acting as if it has hidden inside of it a predictive world model that can make predictions over the time scale of, say, 100 milliseconds. And when those predictions are violated, it sends a complaint to the brain. So it's quite remarkable. So our model does this. Our model reproduces all of these strange phenomena. I won't go into the details, but these are kind of 8 classes of experiments where the left-hand side is experiment, the right-hand side is a model without any further training, and it gets them all right. But this raises profound questions about the nature of explanation in neuroscience, right? For example, the emitted stimulus response, a neuron fires and sends a huge complaint at a particular time. How do I answer the question of, how did my model do that, right? As scientists, we're not just happy with having a complex model of a very simple phenomenon. A simple phenomenon demands a simple answer. In particular, we have a qualitative phenomenon and we demand a qualitative answer to understand it. So systematic approach to arriving at this understanding might go through model reduction. The basic philosophy is we have our big CNN model. It's a pretty complicated model, but it's quite accurate. And the question is, can we find a family of simpler and simpler models of reduced complexity? And this vertical axis is how well the simpler model can predict the behavior of the more complex model, maybe in a restricted set of stimuli. And there's this Pareto optimal curve, for a given model complexity, what's the best predictive accuracy we can achieve? And I would maintain that understanding lies in being able to freely negotiate this Pareto optimal frontier of model accuracy as a function of complexity, and really understanding what it is we can throw away to capture the essence of the phenomena. Of course, this is an optimistic scenario. The curve might look like this, where there is no simpler model than the model itself. I argue that's highly unlikely because the brain is robust, right? What robustness means is its operation can't depend on all of the details. If that's true, then we can get rid of a bunch of details and still mimic its operation. Okay, so that's the hope, but it's a religious hope at the moment. Okay, all right. So what we did is we developed methods for model reduction, borrowing ideas from explainable AI. The technical term that we use is integrated gradients. We extended it to the hidden neurons, but at a very high level, what we did is, for any given stimulus, if a neuron fires, we could carve out an important subcircuit that was responsible for making that neuron fire to that stimulus. And then we could get a reduced model for that particular stimulus. And we could, for example, for the emitted stimulus response, get a very simple model with 3 temporal filters and 3 nonlinearities. And we could actually understand how that model generated the emitted stimulus response. But again, to make a long story short, I'll just give you the take-home message. We got these high throughput recordings, we trained a deep neural network model, and then we worked backwards. For each given stimulus of interest, we found a simplified model. We looked back in the literature for the model that had the most experimental support for that stimulus. And the model that we found by working backward from our deep network matched what was the best model in the literature, except for one, the emitted stimulus response, for which there was no good model, and this constituted the first model that could explain all aspects of the response. So this turns around the process of doing neuroscience on its head. Instead of figuring out interesting experiments one by one, interesting stimuli, just throw the kitchen sink at the brain, natural movies, throw the kitchen sink of machine learning at it, but then work backwards to figure out what's worth explaining. Okay, so right now we're working on pushing this deeper into the brain in collaboration with Andreas Toliasz, where they're recording from the entire visual system from the entire primate visual system, and we're building so-called foundation models of the primate visual system and using explainable AI to try to understand them. Okay, so moving onwards to the second part, task-trained networks from vision to language. So There's always the why question in neuroscience. Why is the brain organized the way it is? Is it organized by evolution for a particular purpose? And if so, what is that purpose? Well, the way to answer the why question in neuroscience is to posit a purpose and then carry out that purpose and try to extract testable predictions and match them to the brain. Okay, so this goes back a long ways, actually. Like a very old paper by Zipser and Anderson tried to explain very complicated response properties in the parietal cortex of your brain. So your parietal cortex is both involved in recognizing stimuli but also controlling eye movements. And there were intermediate neurons in the parietal cortex that depended in a complicated way on where the stimulus was and where your eye was in its socket. And nobody could make sense of that complicated dependence. So they trained a neural network using backpropagation just to foveate objects to foveate objects as objects were moving around. And they looked at the hidden representations of the neural network, and they matched exactly the complicated response properties in the parietal cortex. So that was a huge success. It was a revelation at the time, and this appeared in Nature in 1998. Of course, it was just a one hidden layer network, so we didn't need deep learning to do that. Even older than that, what does the retina know about natural scenes? There's a mysterious finding that the retina computes nearby spatial differences when the world is bright. So it computes spatial differences when the world is bright. When the world is dim, it doesn't do spatial differences. It pools photons and integrates them over a larger range. Right? Why does it do that? It turns out that you can maximize mutual information between the image and the image input and the retinal output under varying signal-to-noise ratios and firing rate constraints, and you find exactly this behavior. It's optimal to reduce redundancy and compute spatial differences if you have high SNR. If you have low SNR, it's better to average over a broader range. 30 years later, we actually extended this to multiple retinal cell types in the primate retina. So the primate retina has 4 dominant cell types that pool over different spatial ranges and so forth. And we could show that that's actually the optimal thing to do by training, we could show it both analytically and by training an optimal convolutional autoencoder of natural movies. And we could explain why we need different cell types. Basically, different cell types, their receptive fields specialize at different locations in the power spectrum of natural movies in space and time. Okay, here at Berkeley, Olshausen and Field is, of course, a wonderful result. There was a mysterious finding. V1 neurons perform edge detection through Gabor-like receptive fields. Bruno and company posited that if you try to learn a sparse code for natural images through dictionary learning, the second layer neurons will have Gabor-like receptive fields. So this suggests that V1 is constructing a sparse code for natural images. Okay. Popping further a little bit, Daniel Yamins, a colleague of mine actually on my floor, there was a mysterious finding. Basically, no model could really predict inferotemporal responses to images well. So inferotemporal cortex is a higher order area in our visual system. They respond to kind of semantic images with a lot of invariance and so forth. So they just trained a deep network on ImageNet, and they tried to linearly regress IT neurons in the brain against neurons in a deep layer of the model. And they could explain about 50% of the explained variance in these images, which was the highest explained variance anybody could achieve at the time. They did it not by fitting a neural model to data. They did it by training a model in ImageNet and then doing regression from neurons to neurons. So that was kind of a bit of a paradigm shift in the field at the time. Okay, now what's really exciting is that this entire game with a long and rich history can be extended to language. And we've luckily selected a fantastic set of speakers who've been leading the field in this game. The basic idea is you have a pre-trained LLM and you try to regress neural activity in the brain against the LLM with different modalities, fMRI, MEG, so forth. You'll hear from sort of Ev Fedorenko on this. You'll hear from Laura Williams on this. You'll hear from Shaili Jain on this. This is just a smattering of papers. It doesn't do justice to the entire field. And so I don't want to steal their thunder and talk about the details of this. You'll be hearing a lot about this going forward. So hopefully this will just tee you off for that. Okay. Okay, now diving deeper into just one example of where theory can play a role. So Umesh asked me, to put some theory in my talk. And I do think we need a lot more theory in this field as opposed to just modeling and then getting high fractions of variance explained. Okay, so let me give you one example of a theory that we did recently. So this is work by my student Ben Surya and also with Chaim Sampolinsky on the connection between neural representation geometry and few-shot concept learning. So this connects deep neural networks in neuroscience and language and vision, actually, as you'll see. So okay, so what is few-shot learning? So imagine a scenario where I give you just a small number of examples of one concept, say a coati, right? And this should be a novel concept, a concept that you haven't encountered before, right? And then a few examples of a numbat, say 4 examples, okay? And then I give you one example, one new example, a test example. So you can think of these as training examples, and this is the test example. And your goal is just to say, is it from class A or class B? Okay, that's the task. So that's a classic few-shot learning task. Okay. Now, how could we possibly solve this few-shot learning task? We or brains? Well, you don't have much training data to deal with, so it's got to be a simple algorithm, right? What's the simplest possible algorithm? Well, the basic idea is these images come into your visual system, and they create a neural activity pattern in some high-order area, say inferior temporal cortex, for example. Okay, and each of these 4 images, say, create 4 different neural activity patterns. You can think of them as points in a high-dimensional space where each axis is the firing rate of one neuron, right? And there might be some prototype for those images. And then the second class comes in and generates 4 images, 4 neural activity patterns, and there might be some exemplar. And that's all you have to deal with, right? So the simplest thing you could imagine doing is learning a separating hyperplane between them that could either be a prototype-based theory that goes from prototype 1 to prototype 2, or it could be an exemplar-based theory that does some kind of max margin hyperplane or something like that. We analyzed a few different algorithms. So the hypothesis is the only concepts that we can learn in few-shot are those whose exemplars all map to a delimited region of some high-dimensional representation space. That's the hypothesis. So for example, like if I showed you 2 random sets of barcodes, they're not going to map in very well-separated regions, presumably in your IT, and you won't be able to do few-shot learning of barcode classes, right? But these images, they should, right? So then we can ask, well, okay, if this is our algorithm, how does the performance depend on the geometry of the class? So you can imagine sampling an infinite number of exemplars from the class, and there'll be some probability distribution in neural activity space, right? Your performance on the classification task will depend on the shape of that distribution. But it turns out if you're in some high-dimensional limit where each neuron contributes a little bit of information to each class, then the performance doesn't actually depend on the detailed geometry of that shape. It only depends on the second-order covariance structure of that cloud, of that probability distributions. So I can characterize the 2 distributions by their means and their covariances. And then we can compute the error as a function of these means and these covariances. Okay? So the mean and the covariance is just like an ellipsoidal approximation to the complex probability distribution. So that's prediction number 1. The probability of error doesn't depend on the detailed shape of the distribution, only on its second-order structure. And then we can actually calculate it. So imagine these are 2 high-dimensional Gaussians, right? We can decompose the error into 4 geometric properties. One is the signal, which is roughly how far apart are the Gaussians. One is the bias, which is roughly if one class is bigger in size than the other, then the decision boundary of a simple algorithm will be biased to the larger class. The third is the dimension, sort of how many dimensions participate in the Gaussian. And the other is a signal-to-noise overlap. The axes of within-class covariance, how do they overlap onto the signal dimension? So there are these 4, and there are mathematical formulas for each of these 4 properties. We can derive an analytic formula for the generalization error as a function of these 4 properties. They behave in ways that we understand. Our simulations match theory. Clearly, if the signal goes up, the error goes down, and so forth. If the signal-to-noise overlap goes up, the error goes up. The dots are numerical experiments of solid curves of theory. So everything works out very nicely. Okay, but what can we do with that? Now we can ask a really interesting question. are the neural representations of monkeys powerful enough to do few-shot learning? Okay. So we tested that. So what we did is we took 64 classes of natural stimuli, and we looked at recordings of 168 neurons, again in this monkey inferior temporal cortex, IT. These are recordings from Jim DiCarlo's lab at MIT. We measured the SNR of one class against another, and we put that on the horizontal axis. So here, in measuring the SNR, we're measuring basically these four properties and computing the SNR. So we're basically just measuring the geometry of neural representations in the monkey. Okay? That's the horizontal axis. And then we just train a classifier to do five-shot classification using our simple algorithm, just a max margin classifier, to do a five-shot prediction, right? And this is our prediction. The dashed lines are our predictions. And so, for example, here's the bear class against all the other classes. And it does well against some classes and worse against other classes. But you can see that all the errors are quite low, right? So what this is showing is it's showing that monkey neural representations in IT are so powerful that they create well-separated semantic classes. So one semantic class will go to one region of neural activity space, another class will go to another region, and their geometry is such that they're well-separated enough that a very simple algorithm can do few-shot classification with only 5 training points, right? So, and this is the confusion matrix that you get. So for example, here are the 64 classes grouped into superclasses. This is the confusion matrix generated from IT. So for example, it confuses faces with other faces, but not with, say, other animals and so forth. And these are the confusion matrices you get if you repeat the same experiment on AlexNet. And you can see that the ways in which deep networks are confused are similar to the ways in which monkeys would be confused if they used our algorithm. Okay. All right. Now remember, there's not much opportunity for the monkey to do much else, right? It's just got 5 examples. Like, what else could it possibly do? It's an interesting question. Anyways, okay, now connecting to language, actually. So, okay, so how can we model zero-shot transfer from language to vision? Okay, so now you're given only language descriptions of 2 classes, and you're supposed to perform visual classification. So, for example, to a human, you might say, well, a coati is, I'm missing something, is a ring-tailed mammal with a slender head and an elongated nose, right? You might communicate that to a human. And you might say a numbat is a striped marsupial with a finely painted muzzle and a bushy tail, okay? So I've just, the only thing you know about the 2 classes is from language, right? And then you give them a test example, maybe this one, right? And you say, is it class A or class B, class 1 or class 2? Or this one, you say, is it class 1 or class 2? So you basically have, for a human to do this, they have to zero-shot transfer their language information to their visual system, right? And then answer a question. This seems like an impossibly difficult phenomenon to model, right? But surprisingly, like a very simple model can model this and get good performance, okay? So the way we decided to model this is we decided to use ancient technology, I mean really, really old language technology, word-to-vec, okay? So for those of you who know, I mean word-to-vec, you could think of this as a masked language model where the model takes a word at the center and a sequence of words in the periphery, and in the output it masks the word at the center and is trying to predict it's trying to predict the center word from its neighbors, right? So this is classic distributional language modeling. You're trying to predict words from their neighbors. So then you get an embedding of all the words in some embedding space, and the neural network uses that embedding space to do the predictions. But the predictions are used to train the embedding space, and then you get a word embedding at the end of the day. So basically, at the end of the day, what word-to-vec does is an extremely simple, just multi-layer neural network model that takes as input words and spits out a vector representation of each word. Okay? So numbat and coati are 2 words in the language, so it creates an embedding for them. Okay? So that's our language model that we use to model this few-shot learning task. Then we also have a ResNet trained on ImageNet, right? And this is an image embedding model, right? You feed in images and you get a neural representation of the images, right? So then how do we model this zero-shot transfer from language to vision? What we do is we take two words. Okay, so again, every ImageNet class has an English word label, right? So we take two classes from ImageNet, and we take the two word labels for those classes, and we feed them into Word2Vec, right? Then we have to somehow transfer this language representation to this visual representation, and let's say we've solved that problem. Then what we do is we get a visual representation of the two categories, and then we get a test example, right? And the test example might fall somewhere in this space. We feed the test example into here. And this is the first time this procedure has used image data, and we just ask, is the image example closer to the centroid for, not even centroid, the word representation transferred to an image for one class versus the other, and that's how we make our decision, right? Now you might ask, how do we get this transfer from a language to a vision representation? We do the simplest thing possible. We have 1,000 ImageNet classes, so we have 1,000 word representations, we have 1,000 image representations, the centers of each class, and then we just learn a rotation matrix to go from language to vision. That's it, just a rotation matrix, linear operation. Okay, and how well do we do? We do remarkably well, just with this very brain-dead kind of procedure, about 93% accuracy. And our theory matches our experiments and so forth. So it shows, I'm still sort of surprised by this result. It shows that there's a remarkable alignment between language and vision, even if the two models were trained completely independent of each other, right? Word2Vec only saw language data. ImageNet only saw images. Of course, anyways. And then just a simple rotation aligns them. Okay. All right, so now now let's have some fun and not just record from the brain, but write to it, okay? So these read-write experiments in brains and machines, and I deliberately put two works together, making mice hallucinate and making LLM graders hallucinate to show you the kind of the alignment between the two fields. Okay, so again, this is the promise of read-write experiments. So now, through calcium recording, we can record now about 10,000 neurons simultaneously. And then also by shining light into the brain, we can target a subset of neurons and make them fire. These neurons have light-gated ion channels such that if light is shined on them, the light will open the ion channels and the neurons will fire. That's the magic of optogenetics. And so we can use holographic stimulation, and by we, I mean my experimental collaborators, of course. We can shine patterns of light into the brain and make a subset of neurons fire. We can make about 100 to 200 neurons fire simultaneously. And we can do this in arbitrary spatial temporal patterns over time. So again, we can model the brain. We can try to understand this model using explainable AI. We can use this explainable AI or control theory to design optimal stimulation patterns to achieve some purpose, either insight or control, right? Okay, so one thing the first work that we did on this together with Carl Dijsselrath was a situation where the mouse is just trained to detect the orientation of gratings, say vertical or horizontal gratings. So if it sees a grating of one type, it's supposed to lick. If it sees a grating of another type, it's not supposed to lick. Okay. We learn which neurons in primary visual cortex respond to these gratings, and then we ask how many neurons suffice to generate a percept. And the answer was pretty surprising, actually. So we stimulate a subset of those neurons that respond to a particular grating, and we ask if the animal will behave as if it saw that grating. So that's how we assess its perception through behavior. And what we found was surprising again. So this is the number of neurons that we stimulate, right? And this is the percent correct behavior that we elicit. And if you look at the x-axis, stimulating 10 neurons is not enough to elicit highly accurate behavior, but stimulating just 20 neurons in all of visual cortex suffices, right? Also, we can record the rest of the population while we're stimulating. So we can ask, what's the rest of the population doing? And there's a very nonlinear response property here, where if you stimulate 20 neurons, 20 to 30 neurons, you get about 15 to 20% of the entire network to activate. The entire network of neurons that have the same tuning as the neurons that you stimulate. The neurons that have different tuning don't get excited. So you get this very specific propagation of activity through the brain if you stimulate, say, 20 neurons that all would have responded to the same grading. We, of course, did the control where you stimulate a random subset of neurons, and you get neither this response in behavior nor this response in the rest of the network. So it's as if the brain is incredibly sensitive to excitation of the correct type. Right? Now, there's some nice theory to do here. Why 20 but not 10? Why is 20 enough but not 10? Well, you can do a very simple back-of-the-envelope calculation. Your neural activity is not quiet. If you close your eyes, there's some pitter-patter of Poisson fluctuations in neural activity, right? And if your network, you can calculate the standard deviation of the Poisson fluctuations above the mean, and it's highly likely to get 10 neurons firing above the mean if you put in the right numbers, but it's very unlikely to get 20 neurons firing above the mean. So there's this kind of noise floor in the brain, and 20 is above the noise floor. So this suggests that this kind of threshold of about 20 neurons is as low as it can possibly be, subject to not having false hallucinations elicited by fluctuations in noise. Right? So the brain is incredibly finely tuned to external stimulation, and we never would have known that had we not been able to directly stimulate neurons in visual cortex. Right? So again, yeah.
So you stimulated 20 neurons.
Yeah.
But there may have been many other 20 neurons that could have been stimulated.
Yeah, each time we did it, we stimulated a random set of 20. So which set of 20 we chose didn't really matter, as long as all 20 of them had the similar tuning. They all responded to at least one grading, and the same grading. Right? We did the same random control, a random set of 20 neurons, we don't get an effect.
I mean, there's a result like this for photoreceptors.
Yes.
X-star and paren.
This is the single photon absorption.
1943,
Yeah. The photoreceptor story is incredible. They knew before they could do the experiments that single photoreceptors could absorb single photons. So the first step of vision, especially in dim light, is a quantum mechanical effect. How did they know that before they could shine individual photons? They basically shine dim flashes, right? And they ask, what's the dimmest you can make the flash before you can see it? And the answer was the flash could be so dim that it generated like 5 to 10 photons, right? So now if 5 to 10 photons are coming into your eye, it's exponentially unlikely. The most likely thing is that each of the individual photons are going to different photoreceptors, right? It's highly unlikely that all 10 photons are going to the same photoreceptor. So this suggests that your ability to detect a dim flash depends on the ability of individual photoreceptors to detect individual photons, which is quite remarkable. We knew about that long before we could do lasers and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Yeah.
Can I ask you a question which is, so many of these tasks that you've been talking about, the retina or input-output or something, and it's really quite dramatic how strong the correspondence is between your neural models and what's happening in the brain. Do you expect this to also hold at higher levels, language, etc.? Do you expect these?
Yeah, you'll see examples of that later this week. But the types of fractions of variance explained in these language models in the brain, around like 30 to 50. I mean, it depends on how you decide what's signal and what's noise and so forth. But I think there's a challenge in the field there, which is the more complicated you make your model, the more doomed to succeed you are, right? In the sense that if you start linearly combining neurons in your model, if your model is complex enough, you'll have a set of basis functions that are rich enough to predict the activity of another neuron, right? But there's ways that people control for that through trained test splits and so forth, right? And so I think the field as a whole needs to do some more careful thinking about what it means to compare a high-dimensional representation in the machine to a high-dimensional representation in the brain, and what we actually learn from that. So I had that in one of my challenges on the early slides. That's the questions to ask the later speakers. Okay, so now, and by the way, we could write down neural network models that could reproduce this phenomena, and basically, we showed in our neural network models that we could show analytically that we could reproduce this phenomena. And what happens is the neural network models are poised near a bifurcation, where a small input will decay, but a slightly larger input will cause a huge activity, transient bump. So it's like an excitable system. It's as if the entire visual cortex, or a subset of visual cortex tuned to the same oriented stimulus, acts like a Hodgkin-Huxley neuron, where a small input will cause the memory voltage to decay, but the large input will cause a huge spike. Okay, now just this is basically the same project, but with a different flavor, but applied to LLMs. Okay, so this is a recent paper that we did. We're just curious about adversarial examples in LLMs, right? So LLMs are being used as decision-making devices nowadays. For example, evaluation devices like grading, LLM grading. I'm sure you've suspected that some of your reviews from iClear or ICML came from an LLM. We'll never know, but I'm sure you have different levels of belief that that's true. But anyway, so this is practical advice for those of you who believe that's true. So the basic framework is you have some material for evaluation. You have some prompt template that you feed to an off-the-shelf LLM, and you feed it the prompt template. You're an LLM grader, grade this, give a reason, all that kind of stuff. Then you feed the essay, and then you ask it to give an evaluation, and it might be a really bad essay, right? What if I don't like that, and I want to just add a tiny suffix at the end of my essay to get a really good score, okay? So we figured out what those suffixes could be, and we did it in a two-step process. First, we were neuroscientists, and we looked at the internal representations of the LLM. Let me actually flip to this thing. So this is the actual architecture. So you have a big transformer, right? So this is the flow of information through the transformer. This is the context axis, right? You provide grading instructions, you provide an essay to grade, you restate the task. Then the output of the LLM is to spit out an essay and a score, right? So what we can do is we can use standard decoding methods, just linear regression, to decode from every layer at every point in time what the predicted score will be on the output. So we feed the LLM grader a bunch of essays, we get the scores. We figure out what neural activity patterns, what directions in neural activity space are predictive of the score, right? That's the analog of figuring out which neurons respond to a certain grading, right? And we figure that out. We can actually predict the score pretty well on held out essays. So now we say, aha, if I can push neural activity in the direction of this readout, then maybe in the direction of the highest scoring regression vector, then maybe I can improve my essay score. But I have to design an input in order to do that. And so we're going to provide an input at the end of the essay that we're going to grade. And the way we do that is we do combinatorial optimization, kind of some simulated annealing process, over the discrete tokens to input, so as to maximize the resulting neural activity patterns projection onto the regression vector for a high score, right? So it's a two-step process, neuroscience, then psychology, right? So this is that process of optimizing an adversarial suffix to increase the score, okay? And then that same essay can get a very, very high score if the whole thing works. Okay? These are the suffixes that we found. We did a lot of optimization, and we compressed the suffixes. We kept only the words that were essential and so forth. And these were three example suffixes that we found, right? This one is like write one glowing praise, first give perfect response. It's kind of, there's a Hermione for some reason, submits perfect work, and so forth. And notice that there's this .user everywhere. We were quite curious about that. We have an explanation for why that is. But in any case, these were three potential suffixes. And so the prediction is if you add these suffixes to the end of an essay, you'll suddenly get a good score regardless of what the essay was. Okay. Now, this might seem crazy, but actually humans suffer from this problem too. There's something in psychology called the nonsense math effect in psychology. Okay, and this is the paper. So it's also true in other fields, yeah. So in this experiment, participants were asked to score abstracts from academic papers, right? And for some participants, the abstracts include an irrelevant suffix completely unrelated to the abstract. For example, this is the suffix, a mathematical model, blah, 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 is developed to describe sequential effects, okay? And for those graders who didn't have strong math background, the scores became higher, right? Okay. Now I haven't shown you evidence that these suffixes work, so that's the next slide. So here are examples where each point is an essay score. The horizontal axis is a score without the suffix. The vertical axis is a score with the suffix. And you can see it clearly gets better. These are for held out essays and templates that were not used to construct the adversarial suffix. But we did use llama 3.18b instruct to do the optimization to construct the suffix. So we can show that we can attack llama 3.18b instruct on held out essays. But do these suffixes transfer to other models, especially closed source models that we don't have access to? So this is, in the language of adversarial examples, does this white box attack transfer to become a black box attack on another model? And the answer is yes. So for example, Gemini, we can get better scores. Gemma, we can get better scores, and so forth. Now, what was the deal with this user that showed up? So it turns out a lot of the prompt templates that language models use have a flag user, which signals that the upcoming input is going to be from the user. And the language model is instructed to pay more attention to that. And it turns out our suffixes discovered that. And then if you take user out of the prompts, you could defend against this attack. But of course, there'll be probably other attacks that show up.
So in some sense, what's common to all these models is that they're using similar data sources.
They're using similar chat templates.
It's the data, not the model.
It's the data, not the model, yeah. And one way to think about it is a model is just a reflection of the data.
Model is like a compilation of the data.
And actually, in the last part in diffusion, I'll show you exactly how it's a compilation of the data. Let's see, I think I have...
Exactly, that's not.
Okay, I may not get to the last part, but just one example that we're super excited about that we just finished like on Friday. I actually pulled an all-nighter with these two students to get this paper written. It was super fun. Mathematical reasoning, right? You know, as a former mathematician, I did my master's in pure math here at Berkeley. Thank you, Berkeley, for letting me have a math degree. I probably didn't deserve it. But anyways, Nikolai Reshetikin was my examiner. I still remember that exam. Anyways, but yeah, so rethinking fine-tuning when scaling test time compute. This is less about neuroscience, but it is about mathematical reasoning, which is thought to be the apex of human intellectual ability, right? Or was thought to be. You know, we'll see. So this should appear on the archive in about a week once we clean it up and so forth. But so how do you solve? How do you do LLMs for mathematical reasoning? The basic idea is you start with a pre-trained model, right? You supervise, fine-tune it, say on a math or theorem-proving data set or so forth. So you maximize the log probability of math data, right? By minimizing cross-entropy loss. And then you might, when you use it at test time, you might use a simple reasoning strategy to use the model, not just next token prediction, but something more sophisticated. Okay? So for example, in our case, we started with a llama model. We fine-tuned it on these data sets, math and mini F2F, using, importantly, cross-entropy loss, right? Which is maximizing the log probability of the next token. But for reasoning, we used a very simple way to scale test time compute, which is called pass at n. It's a very simple process. You just sample n answers to the math question, right? And then you assume that you have access to a verifier. So we did this for theorem proving and for math. We just assume that we have access to a verifier. Say for theorem proving, we can verify if the proof is correct or not. And then we search through those n examples using the Oracle verifier, and we just pick one that's correct, if there is one that's correct. Right, so this is a very simple way of using test time compute for reasoning. There's much more sophisticated ways as well. But now there's a fundamental mismatch between the way we train our model using cross-entropy loss and the way we use our model at test time. And this mismatch can be detrimental. Okay? Here's the key ideas. Okay? Cross-entropy loss is maximum likelihood for next token prediction. Okay? That's why we use it for language models that use next token prediction. But it does not maximize the probability of being correct under pass at n, which is the probability that one amongst n tries is correct, right? Maximum likelihood maximize the probability that one try is correct, right? So it turns out that that is a wrong and overconfident strategy. Cross entropy is wrong and overconfident. It places too much probability on wrong answers, okay? So if you're using pass at n at test time, it's better to limit the confidence and hedge your bets during training, right? The basic idea is, let's say I know ahead of time I got n tries, okay? Let's say I think like answer 1 is the most likely answer. If I only have one try, I'm going to place all my bets on answer number 1.
You want more diversity.
I want more diversity, exactly. That's like limiting confidence. If I have n tries, I'll say, yeah, okay, I think answer 1's pretty good, but I'm not a great mathematician, so there's a chance it's going to be wrong. I only have probability 1 to assign to all my possible answers. So I'm going to reduce the probability of answer 1 and place probability in other answers that I think are less likely to be correct. But since I'm a bad mathematician, it's a good idea to hedge my bets, right? Where I, in this case, is the probability distribution or policy of the LLM, right? Okay. So now it turns out that, so here's evidence that cross-entropy is indeed bad. So here we take a Llama 3 8 billion model. We fine-tune it using cross-entropy loss on direct answers from this math training set. It's a data set of math problems. And we measure pass at n accuracy as a function of how long we trained the model using cross-entropy loss or supervised fine-tuning on the math data set. And you can see that the pass at 1 accuracy, which is just like exactly what cross-entropy is trained to optimize, that increases over training time, right? But pass at n accuracy decreases over training time, right? Again, why is that happening? And I'll show you evidence for that in the next slide. Cross-entropy is placing high bets on many answers, high bets on a few answers. Those answers have a chance of being correct, but are mostly wrong. You can see that the accuracy is 7%, right? So anyway, the key observation is pass 1 performance increases as you expect, but surprisingly, pass n performance decreases. So to show you evidence of this confident and wrong hypothesis, here we're plotting the log probability of the greedy answer for the LLM. So we just decode using the most likely next token until we get an answer. So that's like the greedy output of the LLM. And we compute the probability assigned to the greedy output. So roughly you think about it, the probability of the maximum probability answer roughly under a greedy approximation. You can see that at 1 epoch, the distribution is down here. But at 4 epochs, it's way up here. It's placing a lot of probability on the most likely answer, at least as estimated by the greedy algorithm. That would be great if that answer were correct. The problem is it's not. Out of the greedy answers, most are incorrect, and a small fraction are correct. So now, if you're stuck with an LLM that's overconfident and wrong, scaling test time compute just by taking multiple tries is not going to help you, because most tries will be wrong. Okay. So what you really want to do is push stuff down. So the very simple computationally, okay, so we actually prove a theorem that under a given accuracy constraint, like let's say you can never achieve an accuracy greater than X, out of the space of policies that have some guaranteed error, what is the best thing to do? If your test tribe strategy is pass at n for small n, you want to confidently exploit. You don't have many tries. Put all your bets on what you think is the most likely answer. But if your test tribe strategy is pass at n for large n, you want to unconfidently explore. Spread your probability around many answers. So you're not saying you're confident in any of them, but hopefully one of them out of n will be correct, right? So how do you enforce this? Well, a very simple idea is just to directly optimize the pass at n probability of being correct. It satisfies both limits. And when we do that, this is what we get. So what you're seeing here, this is the n in pass at n. So this is scaling test time compute on the horizontal axis. This is the n prime used in training, right? And so these are different curves for different n prime. This is the Pareto optimal frontier over all possible training strategies, right? And you can see that you achieve the Pareto optimal when n prime is approximately n, so that you align your fine-tuning strategy with your test time scaling strategy. And that's the key, right? In electrical engineering, we're often used to separation theorems, right? The source channel separation theorem. You can optimally compress independently of your channel, and then you can optimally communicate independently of your source. Fantastic. You can separate data compression from channel communication. Wonderful. Kalman filters. You can separate state estimation from control. Unfortunately, you don't have a separation theorem for training time compute and test time compute. If you have a sophisticated test time compute strategy, test time compute scaling strategy, you better co-design your pre-training strategy to match that. Otherwise, you'll do terribly. You won't achieve the Pareto frontier. So that's, I think, a big lesson to take away. Okay, and then just summarize, we have a theory of creativity in diffusion models, and we can explain theoretically what trained diffusion models do. It's all in this paper, and I talked about it at Neurips, so you can probably find a Neurips workshop. So I won't spend any time on this. But just to give you the basic idea, what these diffusion models do is they create new novel samples that are far from the training set by mixing and matching different training set patches at different locations. So it's like a patch-based synthesis model. And we can write down an analytic ODE that solves that problem. And on the left-hand side is our theory, right? On the right-hand side is what a trained diffusion model spits out. So we take a random Gaussian noise sample, we feed it into a trained diffusion model, and we get an image. We take the same Gaussian sample and feed it into our analytically interpretable ODE, and we get another image, the theory image. And you can see the match between theory and experiment. And there's a really nice match. So I think we really understand what diffusion models are doing in this setting. Interestingly, diffusion models have also been used for language. Here's a review for that. And I'm actually wondering, like, how does this patch-based theory of creativity for vision generalize to language? It's an interesting question. We haven't thought about that yet. Okay, and here's a summary, but I think what time? Oh, I actually, okay, yeah. That's my summary.
So I had a question about the last part, the master plan, which is cool.
Yeah.
Somehow it makes me think of explore, exploit.
It definitely is, yeah.
But the formalisms are different, but maybe there is a way.
No, it's very similar.
Because in explore, exploit, again, you're trying to optimize your net gain over a large number of trials.
Exactly, yeah.
As opposed to having just one trial.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of use that. You're absolutely right. Like the way we phrase it is confident exploitation or unconfident exploration. And the only way you can explore is if you spread probability mass over many answers, right? Potential answers. And then you're unconfident. If you can just define model probability assigned to an answer to be the confidence of the model in that answer, then clearly exploration requires being unconfident on many of your answers, right? But that's exactly right. And the basic intuition is, if your test tribe strategy allows you to explore, you should learn an exploratory strategy at training time, right? Not an exploitative strategy at training time. It's the basic intuition.
Thank you for your awesome talk. So you kind of alluded to this earlier in your presentation, but when matching the artificial neural representations with the biological neural representations, the structure of the artificial neural network doesn't need to mimic how we think like the biological process works, right?
No, yeah, usually the connectivity is never usually compared, and it's usually not the correct connectivity. You're mostly worried about functional properties of neurons.
At the beginning of the talk, you mentioned Hebbian learning, fire together, wire together.
Yeah.
And then you showed us a number of techniques where you used objective functions and backpropagation to train. How should we think about that? Do we understand anything about learning?
We don't. This is the worst. This is the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems in one of the biggest embarrassments of the field of theoretical neuroscience. The way I joke about it in my class is the intersection of learning rules that we think are biologically plausible, and the intersection of learning rules that are useful in the sense that you can make money off of them. That the intersection of those two sets is empty. Hebbian learning is plausible. There's biological evidence for it. But we don't know how to solve credit assignment across many layers just using Hebbian learning. The only game for doing that is backpropagation. So a major open problem is how do you do credit assignment across many layers without backprop? There are some glimmers of papers on that, but I think there's no universally accepted solution.
So historically, Fukushima had convnets. The whole design of convolutional neural networks, for which Jan LeCun became famous later, was all there in Fukushima. It's just that Fukushima made...
It was hand designed, right?
Yeah, but
no
Fukushima
training.
paid too much attention to the biology, so he had Hebbian rules, and Jan got rid of the Hebbian rules and put in backprop and succeeded. So by taking a step back from the biology, progress was made.
Yes, but if we could figure out like a magic local learning rule that works, I mean, you could probably. The other problem is there's a hardware lottery issue, right? We're tailoring now our algorithms to work well on GPUs, which is why we're stuck with transformers and various modes of parallelism and stuff like that. So there could be biological learning rules that work well, but we wouldn't know it because no NeurIPS reviewer would accept it, because we can't scale it up. But no, I think it's a very important problem. But it's a very hard problem. I shouldn't. Okay, I don't recommend my own grad students to work on it, but others should. You'll be more famous.
Great talk. In the part where you're going from language, word to vec to ImageNet, there's a bit of a caveat there, right? In that ImageNet is not an entirely vision-only model. So language sneaks in there because it's a supervised model that uses labels.
Yeah, we have the class labels. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And those are actual English words.
Yeah, yeah. Or yeah, basically you have groupings of the images into 1,000 classes. Yeah, that's right.
So how confident? I mean, there is some work suggests that it doesn't only work under these circumstances. But how confident are you that?
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. Here's an easy way to test your hypothesis that classes matter. It's just replace the ResNet trained on ImageNet with classification to a ResNet trained on ImageNet with self-supervised learning, and then see if this thing holds. Can you find an isometry from language to a self-supervised representation? That's a great. We should do that. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Yeah. So brilliant talk. So regarding the collaboration you have with Carl, where is it published first?
So that paper came out in Science right here.
Yeah.
We have some more recent work that we're writing up now. And we scaled it up to 10,000 neurons and stuff like that.
Very good. And then why you didn't choose fear conditioning tasks? Why you haven't?
Oh, yeah. I mean, other people have done that actually. So people have. So fear conditioning, there's various paradigms, but basically you electrocute a rat with a mild shock and in some context, and then the mouse or rat will, when it sees that context, it will crouch in fear. So then you can get rid of the context, but directly stimulate neurons in the amygdala that fire when the mouse shows the fear response, and you can directly stimulate the amygdala and elicit the fear response. So other people have done that.
Yeah, but you can change the context, and then I think it can be beneficial for this study. If you have that fear conditioning task, but at the same time changing the cue, putting on the cue so the mice associate these. So it's an associative memory task, and then my point is that the type of the memory you are targeting for this research, you can play more with fear conditioning tasks.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I mean, this paradigm could be applied all over the brain.
Yeah,
for
and
sure,
then regarding that point about the complexity of the brain, I just wanted to add that regarding the learning rules. About 7% of human genome relates to the genes that are related to the synapse function or structure. So that's how complex we have a synaptic weight. 7% of human genome relates to synapse function or structure. So that complex. And here we have a scalar factor in neural network. So it's very far apart.
Yeah. That's a great stat. Maybe one last question.
Yeah. So again, with the pass at end, the last article that you were presenting, you're explaining this cross entropy loss as causing this sort of overconfidence because you're trying to only get one output as opposed to considering several different possible answers or possibilities. And there's been a lot of research that I've seen, at least, on this sort of overconfidence problem within neural networks, and sort of explaining it by the softmax. You know, when you're training with the softmax activation function, you're sort of artificially forcing it to have one perfect one. So how would you, and so it's looking at the loss versus looking at the activation function. Like, how would you relate those two, I suppose? And does some of your insights within the brain sort of...
So, I suppose if I were to be precise, we haven't really disentangled the contribution of softmax and cross-entropy, because the cross-entropy takes two distributions, right? The softmax output and the correct output, and just computes it as... I didn't actually tell you what the algorithm was, other than saying you directly optimize the pass-at-end probability. Mm-hmm. But if you actually implement that algorithm in an efficient manner, what it does is the following. Let's say you have x and y as the correct input and output, and the model has a guessed probability of p of y given x. What the learning algorithm does is it just computes the gradient with respect to cross-entropy loss, but it attenuates the gradient if p of y given x is too large. So it basically kills the ability of the model to assign higher probability if the probability is already high, right? And so it's a very, very efficient algorithm. It just but it requires the model to use its own confidence to modify the cross-entropy gradient.
And if I may ask, in relation to that, how would you relate that to like learning strategies within the brain as well? Like,
oh, that's
would
a great question.
This sort of unconfidence, or
the brain? I mean, this is just based on introspection. Yeah. We have an incredible ability to modulate our certainty, like to act in ways that are exploitative in certain situations where it really matters, like taking an exam in the exam hall, versus like playing around. If you're like playing around with solutions to a homework set and you have lots of time, like you're playing around with multiple strategies, you don't really care how much time it takes. Like, so our brain has a way to, I mean, you could call it like cranking up or down the temperature in a softmax. That's a very simple analog. We tried that in this setting, is just raise the temperature, like train the model at one temperature, but use a higher temperature at test time. It didn't work as well. So like, yeah, it just didn't work as well. But you know, birds do this too, by the way. When birds are so birds use singing to mate, right? So when birds are singing to a potential mate, their song is perfect. There's no variations. But when it's just practicing, it's all over the place. So the variations matter, actually. It uses the variations to learn. So, and there's a switch, like there's a switch in the basal ganglia versus cortical circuit that are both vying for control of the vocal cords of the bird. I know about this because I worked in birdsong as a postdoc. So the birds can do it, and it's literally just different circuits controlling the output.
Okay.
So a high variance circuit and a low variance circuit. Okay. Yeah. So that switch is something we can probably do as well.
Let's end it here, and I think Sampath has some announcement.
Thank you for a great talk. I don't want to keep you away from lunch and the exciting program in the afternoon.